Before we go into our interview today, I wanted to let everyone know we have a new sponsor for our Energy Question podcast, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, or USOGA for short. First established in 1917, USOGA has been an effective and creative voice for the industry for more than a century now. USOGA is dedicated to educating the public, policymakers, and legislators at the federal, state, and local levels about the value of the domestic oil and natural gas industry. If you're in the industry and not currently a USOGA member, please consider joining the association as a way of helping it tell your story to the policymakers whose actions impact everything you do each and every day. You can start that process by contacting USOGA through its website, usoga.org. Thanks so much to USOGA for sponsoring the Energy Question podcast. And now on with our show. Hello, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackman. I'm your host, David Blackman, and with me today is one of our frequent guests, Daniel Yergin, who to me is the preeminent thought leader on energy issues working today and has been for a long time, frankly. Dan, how are you today?
Fine, glad to be with you again, David.
And I should have mentioned, Dan is the author of the new map. I always like to get a plug in. Which is just a fantastic book and a very prescient book that was written in 2019, Dan, is that right?
Well, first edition came out in 2020, the second one in 2021. And I do look back on it. And people ask me, are you writing a new book? I said, I'm living the new map because the issues that I wrote about are the issues of today, like energy transition.
They really are, and it is really kind of amazing how much you foresaw happening in that book several years before some of these things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place. And as you know, we've talked about before in these interviews, I think you've really foreseen a lot that's been happening with the energy transition as well. And there's a new, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it is, I mean, what was happening is I was going around the world, everywhere I was going, I was hearing, people talk about energy transition. And so it led me in the new map to say, when we talk about energy transitions, what are we talking about? And compare the current one to all the previous ones. And the current one is really different because the current one is meant to happen in a quarter century. The others took over a century and there was really energy addition. So you tried to change a $100 trillion world economy in a quarter century. Was the big question about in the new map, how you do that. And of course, got into the question of minerals, which we'll come back to, I'm sure.
Yes.
And it then is, really helped to shape this new report we've done, call it Shaping a Living Roadmap for the Energy Transition. Because what we did is, we went around the world and did about 10 roundtables in different parts of the world, listening to people talking, and realized how different the perspectives are in different parts of the world. And that is a fundamental theme. It isn't just Brussels that determines what an energy transition will look like.
Right, or Washington, D.C., or California, or Texas, or any single government entity. Although it does seem that the Western governments are at least doing the best they can to act in unison to try to, push this agenda and these alternatives that they seem to have chosen, exclusive of some other alternatives, to be the replacements for fossil fuels and nuclear energy.
Well, I think what's happened, and one of the things we pointed out, there has been this kind of consensus among the Western countries. But then you had supply shocks, you had shortages, you had war in Ukraine, you had this growing north-south tension over these issues, and a host of questions, question of affordability, price, has, I think is forcing a rethinking of what energy transition is and how it works, and particularly for developing nations. Although, look at Germany, which would not have given a minute's thought to importing liquefied natural gas from the United States 2 years ago, is now is importing U.S. LNG and building importing terminals, which just wouldn't have happened before. So when governments, even Western governments, are faced with energy security issues, price issues, they kind of have to rethink their policies.
Yeah, and before this year, Dan, I know the German government was really opposed to entering into long-term supply agreements for LNG, but here just this past week, they signed another one, right? A 20-year
Yeah,
contract for LNG imports.
yeah, it's a recognition. So when supplies are abundant and cheap, you know, you don't worry. But when you're actually going to have shortages, you're going to throw people out of work. Factories aren't going to work. Germany runs the risk of being deindustrialized. They rethink it. So they're still committed, to their agenda, and they're moving ahead on that agenda. But it means a kind of rebalancing, a rethinking of how an energy transition works. And that's what we really heard from the developing countries.
Yeah, and that tension between the developed world and developing countries is really something that's continuing to grow, isn't it? As the Western countries try to really deny, really, or not necessarily forcibly deny, but enact policies that would deny these developing countries, particularly in the global South, from having access to the same kind of cheap and affordable fossil fuel energy that we've had in the West, and it's enabled us to develop our economies like we have.
Yeah, I think that it comes through in the new map. I quote who was the Indian energy minister, petroleum minister, saying there's not a single energy transition. There are energy transitions, plural. And in India, part of the energy transition is people who burn waste and wood using LPG or natural gas. For them, maybe for 1 billion people around the world, that's an energy transition too. And we just did this big conference in Asia called Energy Asia in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And people from all over Asia in a very different perspective, because they said, we need energy to grow. We need natural gas to grow. We'd like to, use natural gas to replace coal and electric generation. But it's a very different agenda. And, the Japanese have done a paper showing kind of the growth, the economic growth that will be lost if you have what we call a linear energy transition in Asia. That will mean lower standards of living for people. So it's all of these things that are forcing this kind of rethinking to go on.
Well, and cost is a pretty significant factor in all this. We hear a lot of messaging from the renewable sector that wind and solar are cheap sources of energy. But as we have continued to load up our grids here in the United States with a lot of renewable energy capacity, not necessarily generation, but capacity, electricity prices have gone up at a pretty rapid pace. And Texas is where I live is certainly that's been the case. And so I wonder, where is that disconnect? What is causing that disconnect?
Well, I think, we've talked in the past about the shale revolution. There's clearly been, David, the solar revolution. The cost of solar has gone down dramatically, 80 or 90%. Wind costs have gone down because technology has improved, blades have gotten bigger. But now we see those costs going up. And this is particularly hitting the offshore wind industry, which, offshore you have more steady winds, you can get larger scale. But what the offshore developers are saying, the costs are going up because of supply chain issues, because of the complexity of the projects. And of course, there are also the challenges around permitting and so forth, the same permitting challenges that affect natural gas pipelines. So, renewables are certainly going to continue to grow, and policy in the US is continuing to push that. But I think that it comes back again to the question of balance.
Right. Yeah. It's been such an interesting thing to observe, and solar certainly has just been exploding here in Texas. I think Texas now leads the country among all the states in terms of installed
solar capacity, which just 2 years ago, was not remotely the case. And isn't that kind of what we should think about for the future? Because solar, to me, has so much more versatility in terms of the way you can install it and use it than wind does. Aren't we reaching a point where we're getting kind of saturated with wind, and now solar is probably going to be the preferred renewable source?
Well, each has its attributes because, the solar, you do need the sun to shine and you need storage on large scale.
Right.
Wind may blow at different times. But I think the advance of solar is very strong. But then you get into this other issue, which is called geopolitics, which is where do the solar panels come from? And 80% of roughly in the world come from China. And this now gets caught up in what is becoming the big geopolitical issue, and the big global economic issue, which is the relationship between China and the United States and the rising tension there. And that's true, solar, but look at electric batteries for cars. Look at look at minerals. All of those things are now the U.S. has just put rules in to limit investment by U.S. companies and persons and funds in Chinese sectors of Chinese technology. So all of that's going to affect energy. And by the way, what's a very important market for U.S. Exports of LNG and oil happens to be China.
Yeah. A very significant market. The minerals question is something I've written a lot about over the last 3 years. And it seems that, every time I think that some of the issues are being resolved, we see some more issues pop up. The Biden administration in 2021, President Biden made a speech committing to this whole of government approach to establish to supply chains and promote the development of the production of those minerals like lithium and cobalt and other minerals that we do have resources of in the United States. Is that whole of government effort starting to bear enough fruit here 2 years later, in your view?
I would say no. And I would say no because these permitting issues are so difficult. It takes so long to get a permit, and maybe you'll never get a permit. We have some big deposits of minerals that just aren't getting developed. And you talk to people who are in the, mining, critical minerals, whatever you want to call that business, and they just say that the permitting, it just goes on and on. There are always new ways to oppose it. And I think the administration is, on the one hand, committed, if you look to the IRA, to increase reliance on on minerals either coming from the US or from free trade partners. On the other hand, it's very difficult to get things permitted. And we just have a study that's coming out this month saying what the impact of the IRA, this massive, historic, huge act, is on demand for lithium, for copper, for cobalt and nickel.
Oh.
And already the demand was growing very significantly,
right.
And it's going to grow even more. And so I think the phrase we use in the report is there are considerable challenges to meeting the objectives. I think that's the way we put it in quotes, considerable challenges.
That is a masterful understatement, I have to say. When is that report coming out? I want to be sure I see it.
It will come out next week, actually.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Right. So we just did this big report on energy, global view of energy transition. That's just come out, and then that will be next week. So we've been working on both of these sort of simultaneously.
Fantastic. That'll be a wonderful asset. In the meantime, while we are struggling in the U.S. with these permitting issues, which is another subject I've written a lot about because I was intimately involved in them for 20 years.
You know that they don't get any easier.
No, they don't. They only get harder. And Dan, the conundrum here is that almost all of them are related to our major environmental protection statutes, right? I mean, how do you speed up permitting
Yeah.
without also damaging these protections that are in place for endangered species and water and air quality and all those kinds of things that we passed these major statutes 50
Well,
years ago to protect.
well, and then of course you have, and these go through the regulatory review, then there are the judicial challenges. And there's always room for more judicial challenges that just, it becomes, so it's not only the permitting, but it's what happens after the permit is done.
Right, exactly. So I'm going all over the landscape here, but I love getting your views on these things. This brings me to another almost crisis issue that's impacting our grid, and that is the inability to source adequate supplies of transformers, particularly the high capacity transformers. I've interviewed executives in the power industry over the past few months, all of whom say it's taking years in some cases to source new transformers, particularly the high capacity kind.
Yeah, and that's what are people saying? 4 or 5 year lead times.
Yeah,
and that's something, David. It's good you're focusing on it because that doesn't get much attention, and yet, you're going to need these, for the resilience of the system, particularly
right.
if you're pushing more and more that our economy is going to be electrified. It's going to be try and shift more to electrons than molecules. Then the integrity and the stability of the electric power system is critical. And that gets you back again to these vexing questions of the supply chains that are necessary to maintain resilience.
Yeah, and with the transformers too, they're an integral part of any transmission project, right? And we're going to need, according to the Biden administration, at least 47,000 miles of new high capacity transmission by 2032, I think the target is. I just wrote a story a few weeks ago about this Transwest transmission project that's taking wind generation electricity from Wyoming to the West Coast. It took 16 years just to get the permits for that 800 miles of transmission. Is it even possible that the United States is capable of building 47,000 miles of transmission in 9 years?
I think you've written the article on it, but I would say again, why don't we use that phrase, considerable challenges?
Okay. Yeah.
So is that wind system, transmission system, it has its permits now, or is it still being challenged?
They got the final permit in, I believe, May, is from the Department of Interior, was the final permit. But that permitting process started in 2007. And so it's taken 16 years to get the permits in place, and now it's just going to take them a couple of years to build the system, right? And the permits also include, local permits, state permits, getting all your rights of way permitted. That, you have to condemn thousands and thousands of acres of land for the rights of way for any project like that.
Are there still judicial challenges to it?
There are, and so it could take even longer, right? And more lawsuits are going to arise after the construction begins. And so, as it does with any project, pipeline project, transmission project, anything like that. And so, yes, our system doesn't seem to be, it is obviously not set up to facilitate this kind of a rapid transition, which I think, is part of the germinating reason for the report you just released, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because it was trying to, instead of, saying that you have a linear energy transition where you have a single scenario that says this will happen in 2050, multidimensional that recognizes issues we've been talking about, minerals, permitting, but also recognizes the different position of developing countries as opposed to developed countries. Right. It's interesting, even China now. The other thing about the 2050 goal that I always puzzle over is China's goal is 2060, Indonesia's goal is 2060, Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, its goal is 2060, India's goal is 2070. you're talking about over half the world's emissions that are not aimed at a 2050 goal. So
Yeah.
I just, I just kind of scratch my head and try and say, well, how does that math work? And it's interesting, even China now, it continues to, of course, push ahead. Half the wind and solar in the world is in China. But, they've also said that energy security takes primacy over
Sure.
climate goals and
Sure.
economic development, particularly now with what you see with China, this slowing of the Chinese economy. David, if we went back to the first half of this year, people said oil market, energy markets are really going to boom, strengthen the second half because of the rebound of the Chinese economy. But the rebound of Chinese economy has been far less than the rebound that was anticipated.
Right.
And, China's responsible for maybe half the growth in global demand in 2023. And so that has, that was a surprise for the markets. The OPEC plus countries have coped by cutting back supply, but this kind of weakness in the Chinese economy, that's going to be their focus of the Chinese government now, because they need growth. They have all of these millions and millions of college graduates who can't get jobs.
Right.
So they're going to be focused on that as their number one objective.
And that, of course, drives their continued permitting of new coal-fired power, which
Exactly.
they have to generate electricity.
And they need the reliability. They need the reliability. Now, they're going to change the interface, I think, between renewables and coal to some degree, but they're continuing to permit coal plants.
Right.
and build them in a rather quick, rather timely way.
And then the other thing that we see them doing, which they did earlier this year with Bolivia, is tying up mineral resources for these critical minerals in other countries, right? And to a large extent in the global South.
That's so significant. It was, it was clear when, one of the things, if you remember in the new map, I said we're moving from this era of big oil to big shovels, and China wants to control a lot of those shovels. There are, around the world, you see they have developed a preponderant position. Look at nickel in Indonesia. And, the Chinese have different metrics. State-owned companies, they don't have the same pressure from institutional investors that Western companies have.
Right.
And so they really do have a preponderant. And then when you look at processing, it's even greater. Now, I think the Chinese started their drive for minerals because they were such big consumers of it. And it was part of their urbanization, industrialization. But it's now turned into this strategic issue. And the US and the Europeans have responded with this mineral security partnership where they don't mention China, but they talk about diversifying supply chains, which is a code phrase for shifting away from China.
Right.
But you look at, 40 to 50% of copper is processed in China, and you go down, as you say, the minerals. It's not only the mining and the extraction, but the processing. That China is in a very critical role there.
Yeah, I think they process like 70% of all the lithium.
Right.
It's just it's an amazing thing, and of course you have to admire the capacity of their economy to build all that out and dominate the market that way. But it's a dangerous thing for us if we're not successful in liberating those supply chains. Isn't the inevitable outcome that the United States ends up very reliant on China and its relationship with China for its own energy security at the end of the day?
Well, I think we're already, in terms of new energies, it's funny, in terms of old energies, traditional energies, of course, as we say, they're importing from us. But in terms of electric batteries for cars, in terms of, we said, solar, in terms of these other minerals and processing, high degree of reliance on China. And, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is meant to reduce that. But as we see with our new, this new study that we've done, that's going to be very difficult to do. So it's clear that this whole drive of energy transition is going to become entangled, or is being increasingly entangled, in this other thing called great power competition between the United States and China. And that's going to make it a lot more complicated.
Yeah. Back to the new report. One of the key charts in the report that I found very interesting, we talked about the net zero pledges that these countries have made around the world, and about something over 80% of all the countries on Earth have made these pledges now. But one of the charts in the report indicates that just 16% of global emissions are subject to net zero pledges that are binding, legally binding on the countries to meet. That seems important to me. I mean, is it an important aspect of all this that most of the emissions are not subject to pledges that are even binding?
Well, I think that's it's very significant, because you know, when you make a 2050 pledge in 2016, that's pretty far away. But when you're a quarter century away, you're getting closer and closer, and the question of cost and disruption becomes a much bigger issue.
Yeah.
So I think there'll be pressure on governments, and we'll see at this COP28, to be tougher, but then there's the reality of doing it and what you're committing to, and what it's going to do to your economy. And by the way, where's the lithium? Where's the copper? Where's all this stuff that you need? That, you know, it isn't just the wind and the sun. It's, you need all these materials. And by the way, you also need craftspeople
Yes.
to build these things. And that, so, you know, so I think that is quite significant, that these are pledges. And, you know, 2050, none of the people making the pledges today, except here and there, maybe, you know, probably Vladimir. Well, I'm just going to say Putin. You know, who's going to be? Who's going to be? They're not going to be the ones who have to meet the pledge.
Yeah,
it's going to be different people, and they'll be modified. And I think then that was again what, you know, drove this study on energy transition, is the sense that the last 2 years have demonstrated that it is more complicated and indeed more challenging than just drawing a scenario and putting numbers on it and say, oh, this is how it will happen, you know, unfold. There's something called the real world that has to be dealt with as well.
Yeah. Another mineral that I don't think gets talked about enough, certainly I don't write about it as often as I should, is uranium. The president, 2 days before we're recording this interview, went to Utah, set aside 1 million acres of federal lands around the Grand Canyon that are known to be pretty rich in uranium resource. And the United States is heavily reliant, of course, on imports of uranium right now. Some of it coming from Russia, in fact.
Let me pause there, David. A lot of it coming from Russia.
Yeah, a lot of it coming from Russia.
You know, what is it? Roughly about 40-50% of world uranium is mined in Kazakhstan, and roughly that same amount is processed in Russia.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
You know, and it's not just those federal lands out there in Utah. I mean, South Texas is incredibly rich in uranium resource, and yet hardly any of it's being mined currently. I mean, there is some being mined in parts of South Texas where I come from.
Is it the economics?
I think it's the economics, and wouldn't it behoove us as a country to work to change those economics? Yeah. So that, I mean, aren't we going to have an expansion of nuclear to ever hope to get to any sort of a net zero posture?
Yeah, and I think we are seeing this next generation of nuclear. I mean, more and more seriousness around the small nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
At our CERAWeek conference in Houston, the CEO of Dow said that they expect to have a small nuclear reactor in operation around 2030 in one of their facilities. So there is this push for this next generation. Of course, that will mean more uranium is required. But, you know, do you want to import it from Russia? Where do you want to get it from? And of course, the other area that is mineral rich is Africa. And as we've seen with this coup in Niger,
Yeah.
it appears that Russia and the Russia's Wagner group are extending their sway over this significant part of Africa, which is mineral rich as well.
Well, I mean, from their standpoint, that's a smart strategic move.
Yeah, and it's a cheap investment for them.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
you only need to put a few thousand Wagner troops into a country to bolster the regime that you like. And
Yeah.
by the way, replenish the Kremlin's coffers too with the revenues from all these minerals.
Yes, and unfortunately, we see what the Kremlin uses those proceeds for in Ukraine. Do you see, just as a final question, and feel free not to answer if you don't want to express an opinion, but I mean, are we any closer to a resolution of what's going on in Ukraine than we were 6 months ago?
At this point, I would say no. It looks like it's becoming more like not a frozen conflict. It's not frozen, but more like a World War I, a protracted war. I mean, it does appear that Vladimir Putin feels he has time on his side and waiting for the outcome of the 2024 U.S. presidential election.
Yeah.
The U.S. and the others have supplied weapons, but with long delays, first saying no and then saying yes. And, things can change. I think that there's a risk that it may have more impact on the oil market than people are now thinking. Because if you look at, just at least, and of course, a month from now, 2 months from now can look different, but Russia's basically been attacking economic lifelines of Ukraine in terms of grain exports and so forth, deliberately targeting that, and that's going to affect world food supplies.
Right.
And I think the Ukrainians we've seen them hit one Russian tanker, and there may be more pressure, more attacks on the Russian oil infrastructure in response to what Russia's doing to the economic infrastructure of Ukraine. So I think there's a bigger risk there. People are now thinking about. They kind of assume we know where it is, but it now looks like it's dug in for a long time, and and Putin has, that phrase, when you're in a hole, stop digging. He keeps digging in deeper.
Yeah.
So it may come and go from the front pages and from websites and so forth in terms of its prominence, but it can have a very big effect, and a very big effect on U.S.-Chinese relations too.
Yeah.
So we are in a fraught geopolitical time, and you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at what's happening on the energy side as well.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be an argument for our country, as an example, to be making or implementing policies designed to improve our level of energy security?
Yeah, I think absolutely. In fact, one difference now than 2 years ago is energy security is truly back on the table. And you look, if the next few months we see oil prices, they're now, of course, a lot of volatility in prices. A few months ago, people were thinking the price was going to go below 70. Now it's the mid 80s is the kind of consensus view.
Yeah.
If they go up, you're going to see a lot of agitation, political agitation around that, and some of the same old talking points will come out again. And again, energy security, it's gonna be there, and it hits the United States, but it really hits the developing countries, who for them it's a huge cost. So the next few months we may see much more focus once again on oil prices and their economic impacts, and a lot of politicking around that.
Well, let me ask one more question. Every answer you give makes me think of three more questions, but of course, the prize to me is the greatest book ever written about oil and gas, and of course that was your first book, written When? 1988?
Well, I published it at the beginning of the 1990s. It was 7 years. Actually, I'd had a couple of books before that, but the prize was the prize.
Well, in reading that book, of course, a big part of the narrative is how critical it has been throughout the 20th century to keep supply lines open for petroleum whenever there's a war going on, right? Have we reached a point, and I just out of concern for where we may be headed in Europe right now, is that any less of a significant factor today than it was in 1944?
Well, let me think about it. I mean, we have a more diversified energy system today
Right.
than we did then. I mean, there was no such thing as LNG, and natural gas, in fact, was not a big fuel. Of course, solar, wind were not factors. Coal was, a dominant energy resource. But I think that, I'd say really the strategic significance of oil was demonstrated in the First World War. And I think, we see it now. We now have basically, we used to, until February 23rd of last year, we had a global oil market. We don't anymore. We have a divided oil market.
Yeah.
Russian oil goes one place and it doesn't go to its natural market in Europe. So I think oil continues to be, of all the commodities, the most strategic commodity for keeping militaries going, for keeping economies going. Obviously, I think we're going to see minerals, which were kind of boring or people didn't want to pay attention to them unless you were in the business. They're going to take on an increasingly significant strategic role as well.
Yeah.
So I think this whole complex of the minerals, oil, natural gas, metals, they all come together as a sort of strategic focus that are critical for economies going forward and very critical for national power.
Well, Dan, I can't thank you enough for this. We went over, but I could ask you 100 more questions here, but I want to respect your time, and I hope to be able to do this again in a few months.
Yes, well, we should certainly do it. As we go later into the autumn or winter, the world keeps changing, and so we should definitely, we should make this a regular dialogue, and very much appreciate the opportunity to talk with you again, David. So thanks.
Well, thank you, and yeah, I'll plan to come back to you after COP 28, and we can talk about what happened there.
I think that would be very timely. So late December, early January would be a great time to pick up the conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And that's all for today for the Energy Question.